Well, good morning, church. It is indeed good for us to be together, and I need to tell you that it is good for me to be here. As Alan mentioned a moment ago, we lost my mother-in-law this last week on Friday, and there is no place that I would rather be this morning than right here, surrounded by all of you. Sandy was a beautiful, beautiful person, inside and out. She was gracious. She was kind, she was generous. She could also be feisty, sometimes a little stubborn. As Kelly said, leave it up to my mom to die on Good Friday. She wouldn't want Jesus to get all the attention. Let me be clear, that was Kelly that said that, not me. But I simply want to say thank you on behalf of Kelly and the rest of my family for the outpouring of love and support over these last few days. As often happens in moments like this, it is the minister's family that is ministered to, and so we are incredibly grateful. And so thank you on behalf of my entire family. We have 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, telling the story of his ministry. We call them Gospels. And all of them move pretty rapidly until they get to the last hours of his life. If this were a movie, the scenes would be moving pretty quickly until they get to those last hours, and then things would slow down, and there would be a lot more detail. It's almost as if the Gospels are introductions to the passages about the death and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, John's Gospel, which we will be reading from this morning, is 21 chapters long. 12 of those chapters deal with the events of the last week of Jesus' life. In that week, we read of some of the horrible atrocities that happened. His motivations and his authority was questioned. One of his disciples, one of his best friends, betrays him and hands him over to the authorities, sells him out. Another disciple, Peter, denied that he even knew him. The rest of the disciples, they all fell asleep when he asked them to stay awake while he prayed. His best friends were not there for him when they needed him the most. And then there was a torture, an eventual death of Jesus. And all of those stories are told with great detail and nuance. But friends, we're here today because we know that that's not the end of the story. That there's more to it than that the last word belongs not to those that would inflict humiliation and pain and violence. No, friends, the last word belongs to God. So I invite you to hear this word from John's Gospel.
Our reading this morning comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. If you would like to follow along in your pew Bible, you can find this text on page 47 of the New Testament. Early, on the first day of the week, when it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciples set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, now rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and he believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And when she had said this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, your God and my God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. The word of God for the people of God.
If I could begin this morning with a bit of a confession, and that is that us preacher types, we have sort of a love-hate relationship with Easter. Now, don't get me wrong. It's my favorite day of the year. My whole theology is based upon this understanding. It's a big day. We love the pageantry, the huge crowds. But what you need to know is that there's a lot of pressure on the preacher on a day like today. There are some, and I know this may come as a shock to you, but there are some who this might be the only day of the year that they come to church. Not in this church, I know that that's not the case here, but I've heard in other churches that that's the case. And every year the story's the same. But we always need to have a fresh word, a new take, to find a way that is engaging and fresh, and compelling. So, as you can imagine, this last week, a bunch of my friends and colleagues, the preacher types, we've all been texting and emailing and calling and sending notes and stories and ideas, something that might be new, just looking for ideas. You know, I mentioned that one time to a women's group in the church, and one of them spoke up and said, "Russ, if I were you, I would complain." I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she says, "Well, clearly they're not sending you the good stuff." Like I said, love-hate relationship. So where do we start on a day like today? I suppose at the beginning, it's always a good place to start. And what we need to make sure that we are fully aware of is that on that first Easter, there was little hope. That on that first Easter, there was little hope. Did you hear how the story began? That early on the first day, while it was still dark, John says. While it was still dark. That's quite a phrase, isn't it? Now, I firmly believe that John was not just telling us the time, that he was also giving us an image. He was painting a picture for us. While it was still dark. You see, it was still dark with Peter's denial. It was dark with the betrayal of the disciples, his closest friends, his family. It was dark with the apparent victory of the worst evil turned loose on the very best of us. But then there's just one ember of light. Her name was Mary Magdalene, and she was there on Friday. She was there at Calvary, standing off at a distance, but yet she saw what they did to Jesus. She heard the screams. She watched him die. And while on Friday she stood at a distance, today she drew near. She came close in order to take care of Jesus' dead body. You see, it's important for us to remember that she came that first morning out of duty, not out of hope. She came out of duty, out of hope. There was a time when she dared to dream because of what Jesus brought, because of what he was about, what he stood for, what he represented, but not anymore. The feet that had walked on water had been pierced. The hands that had healed lepers had been stilled. It was all over now. She watched him die. He was dead. And so was her dream. No, she came out of duty that day, not out of hope. John's words were right. It was still dark. But how quickly things can change. When she arrives, the stone's been rolled away already, and some of the disciples show up, and there's angels, and the whole thing was sort of a blur. The whole thing was sort of a blur. It's hard to see, isn't it? Through the veil of tears, through all of that grief. But then she discovers the one that she thought was the gardener. Well, he knew her name. And it turns out that wasn't the gardener at all, but in the speaking of a single word, her name, her eyes are open, her heart is open, and she discovers that her world has been turned inside out and upside down. Because in that moment, dawn begins to break, and the first light of day begins to rise in the horizon. I've been doing ministry now for going on 30 years. And in my experience, I've come to the realization that there are two kinds of people that come to church on Sunday, on Easter Sunday. One, those that believe the story is true. And secondly, those who desperately want it to be true, even if they can't wrap their head and their heart around it. Those that believe it's true, those that want it to be true, regardless of how we come, whether we believe a little, whether we believe a lot, we all want it to be true. Tom Long is a preaching professor at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta. And one time he was at a conference and staying at a hotel. And when he checked into the hotel, he noticed that there were these signs all over, not with the hotel itself, but signs all over next to the elevators on each of the floors. And all the signs said the same: party in room 625. Everyone welcome. Thought it was a little strange, but didn't think too much of it until a couple hours later. Got a little bored, got a little restless, so he decided to check it out. Put on his shoes and made his way towards the elevator, and there on all the buttons, there was a sign taped over the other one that said party in room 625, everyone welcome. This one said party in room 625 was a joke. Please disregard. Turns out some of the business associates of the guy in room 625 were playing a pretty good joke, encouraging everybody to show up at his room. But you know what I think of when I hear that story? When I hear that story, I think of the church. I think of the church because all too often the church has invited people to come, promising them a party, promising them new life, a fresh start, open doors as wide as an open tomb. But once they arrive, they stand with arms folded, telling them how bad they are, asking for some sort of an account of all of the mistakes that people have made in their lives, thinking somehow that we can make people good by telling them how bad they are. And anyone who's ever parented a child know that that is a recipe for disaster. You see, I thank God every day. I thank God every single day that in this place, the faith of this church is that we stand boldly and proudly and say that the empty tomb is good news for every single human being, regardless of their past, regardless of their background, regardless of what they have done to this point in their life. It's good news for everybody. Not because of the faith that you have, but because of the faith that God has in you. And that's good. That's good Because some days, in John's words, it's still dark. You see, anyone who lives with any sense of compassion knows that there is brokenness everywhere, that there are signs of crucifixion and death all around us. And sometimes life is just hard. Not because we're doing it wrong, just because it is. And we've all experienced that. We've known moments of loss, of pain, of grief, of darkness. Moments when we wonder, how are we going to go on? Back in November, the night before Thanksgiving, we lost several members of a beloved family in this congregation in the midst of a horrific car accident. Zach, along with his two children, Judson and Lindsay, were killed. And the kid's mom and Zach's wife, Lauren, somehow miraculously survived. It was an unspeakable tragedy that rocked their family, this congregation, and I would even say the entire city of Fort Worth and beyond. And the question that I get more often than any other is, how is Lauren doing? And what I often say is, she is doing the hard work of healing, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And given what she's been through, she is doing remarkably well. The tears come often and easily, but so do smiles and laughter as she remembers them and holds them in her heart. And she has learned that it's possible to feel and experience two different things at the same time, that one can hold gratitude and sorrow sometimes at the exact same time. That it's possible to hold two things at once. I spoke with her this week. I called her and asked. I said, Lauren, it's Easter. I'm preaching on hope. I need to ask, where do you see hope these days? Where do you find it? And she thought for a moment and she says, Russ, there is hope. There are moments of hope, and sometimes, I'll be honest with you, sometimes they're hard to find, but they're there. Mostly, I see them, she said, in the way that all three of them are being loved and remembered. The outpouring, the demonstrations of love, they have been so beautiful and so heartfelt and so meaningful for me. And she said, I see hope in the goodness of people. People that have been so incredible to me and to the rest of my family in the midst of all of this. I am so grateful, she said. Sometimes we think that to find hope and joy, we have to eliminate sorrow. But what she has come to discover is that you can still experience joy in the midst of something horrific. She told me about a podcast that she listened to recently. Someone who had been through struggles of her own sent it to her, and in the podcast, they interviewed Jerry Sitzer, a person who I've quoted a number of times. Jerry, who, like Lauren and the rest of the McElroy family, lost his family in a terrible accident, also to a drunk driver. And he uses an analogy that was helpful for Lauren. He said, it's like you have this huge, beautiful oak tree, a beautiful tree in your backyard. And as a family, you have all these beautiful moments, these beautiful memories about all the picnics that you had underneath the tree, about the kids that would climb in the branches and swing from its limbs, the tree houses that you would build. But that tree gets diseased and has to be cut down. And now every time you look in that backyard, you see an empty space that was once occupied by a beautiful tree. And in that moment, you feel that loss. You feel that loss that was, all of those memories had been stripped away because that tree is no longer there. But finally, over time, you come to decide that, I can't replace that tree. But I can plant around the stump that's there. And you plant bushes and flowers. Maybe you build a pergola, whatever. You make it look nice. But that stump is still there, and it represents what you lost. But the planting of new life represents the kind of life that you want to live now going forward. As Sister says, the experience of loss will never go away, but we can learn to carry it. And it can become integrated into a larger, more healthier whole. You see, that loss is integrated into a larger landscape, dare I say, a larger story. And it's a story of redemption. You see, friends, that's Easter. That right there, that is Easter. Easter says to all of us that there is always hope. That there are signs of hope and redemption that are all around us. And sometimes, yes, you have to look for them. But if we pay attention, if we have our eyes and our hearts open, we can see them. We can see signs that death is not the final word. We can see that the worst things are never the last things, that love is stronger than hate, that forgiveness is better than revenge, that light will defeat the darkness, that fear can be overwhelmed by hope. You see, Easter, resurrection, is not just about life after death. Easter is about life before death. And it reminds you that you aren't finished with your life yet, that you still have more unprecedented life ahead of you. And it's about our ability to love in the light of hope, to love each other into an abundant life. In his book, A Grace Disguised, Sitzer, who I spoke of a moment ago, tells of a letter that he sends to his sister. And in that letter, he said, "Every time I see a sunset, it feels like my life. It feels like the sun is setting on my life, that there's nothing left anymore." And his sister wrote back and said, "Jerry, I want you to turn around, about face, 180 degrees, and just wait. Because on another shore is a sunrise. And that sunrise will be calling you to pick up the pieces of your life and to take the next step." And that's exactly what he has done. You know, in the Old Testament, there's this great story about Moses encountering God in a burning bush. And Moses asked God, "What's your name? What do I call you?" Now, Christian Bibles, like the one that we have in our pews, the ones that we have in our home, translate God's response as, "I am who I am." But if you look closely, the Hebrew that is used there, the verb is not in present tense, but rather future. And so the rabbis will tell us, the rabbis will say that a better way to translate that is, "I will be what I will be." I will be what I will be. And the Apostle Paul gets this forward-looking idea when describing his own life, saying, forgetting what lies behind and straining towards what lies ahead. And the man at the tomb who tells mourning Mary that Christ is ahead of her, not just stuck in her memories anymore. I will be who I will be. Like I said, I've been doing this a long time. And yet people still ask me from time to time, "Russ, do you really believe this stuff? You seem like a smart guy. Do you really believe this stuff? That Jesus rose from the dead?" My response is always the same. I not only believe it, but I'm counting on it. I not only believe it, but I am counting on it. I am building my life around it. I'm counting on the fact that there is always hope, that God walks with us to hell and back, that the God that we worship is the God of the second chance, that we don't need to be afraid anymore. I'm counting on hate and sickness and death not having the last word. That when we walk in the footsteps of the resurrected Christ, that we walk with hope. You know, in Atlanta, there's a place where children who are dying can stay with their parents. It's a hospice for children. And across the front of that house, right above the front door, there is this huge banner. Bright, beautiful colors. It's tie-dye. Looks like an Easter egg. And it simply says, "Turn off the light because the dawn is coming." Turn off the light. The dawn is coming. Friends, today the wait is over. This morning, we celebrate that the first light of dawn, the dawn of a new day. And may we turn to see that the tomb is empty, that our lives might be filled with Easter sunrises and with eternal hope. Friends, Christ is risen.